At a third time pass, motion reconsider be laid on the table. There be no intervening action or debate. Any statements relating to this matter be printed in the record at the appropriate place as if read.
Without objection.
President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I believe that Chairman Leahy will shortly be joining us to discuss the Disclose Act. In the time that we have before his arrival, I wanted to ask unanimous consent that an op-ed piece that was authored by former Senator Warren Rudman and former Senator Chuck Hagel, two former senators, two Republican former senators who really distinguished themselves in this body and have gotten together to write an article about the Disclose Act. I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the op-ed piece that they have written be made a matter of
without objection
in this debate. And I think what I'd like to do is actually share some of the thoughts from it. Here's what Senator Rudman and Senator Hagel, two former Republican senators, say. Since the beginning of the current election cycle, extremely wealthy individuals, corporations, and trade unions, all of them determined to influence who is in the White House next year, have spent more than $160 million excluding party expenditures. That's an incredible amount of money. To put it in perspective, at this point in 2008, about $36 million had been spent on independent expenditures, independent meaning independent of a candidate's campaign. In all of 2006, in fact, only $160 million was spent this way. In other words, we've already surpassed 2000, and it's July. In the near term, there's nothing we can do to reverse this dramatic increase in independent expenditures. Yet what really alarms us, these two distinguished former Republican senators wrote, about this situation is that we can't find out who is behind these blatant attempts to control the outcome of our elections. We are inundated with extraordinarily negative advertising on television every evening and have no way to know who's paying for it and what their agenda might be. In fact, it's conceivable that we have created such a glaring loophole in our election process that foreign interests could directly influence the outcome of our elections. And we might not even know it had happened until after the election, if at all. This is because unions, corporations, super PACs, and other organizations are able to make unlimited, independent expenditures on our elections without readily and openly disclosing where the money they are spending is coming from. As a result, we are unable to get the information we need to decide who should represent us and take on our country's challenges. Unlike the unlimited amount of campaign spending, this lack of transparency in campaign spending is something we can fix, and fix right now, without opening the door to more scrutiny by the Supreme Court. A bill being debated this week in the Senate called the Disclose Act of 2012 is a well-researched, well-conceived solution to this insufferable situation. Unfortunately, on Monday, the Senate voted, mostly along party lines, to block the bill from going forward. But the Disclose Act is not dead. As of now, it is 9 short of the 60 votes it needs. They then described the bill and continue here. We believe that every senator should embrace the Disclose Act of 2012. This legislation treats trade unions and corporations equally. and gives neither party an advantage. It is good for Republicans and it is good for Democrats. Most important, it is good for the American people. What's more, every senator considering re-election faces the possibility of being blindsided by a well-funded, anonymous campaign challenging his or her record, integrity, or both. The act under consideration would prevent this from happening to anyone running for Congress. Without the transparency offered by the Disclose Act of 2012, we fear long-term consequences that will hurt our democracy profoundly. We're already seeing too many of our former colleagues leaving public office because the partisanship has become stifling and toxic. If campaigning for office continues to be so heavily affected by anonymous, out-of-district influences running negative advertising, we fear even more incumbents will decline to run, and many of our most capable potential leaders will shy away from elective office. No thinking person can deny, they say, that the current situation is unacceptable and intolerable. We urge all senators to engage in a bipartisan effort to enact this critically needed legislation. The Disclose Act of 2012 is a prudent and important first step in restoring some sanity to our democratic process. And then the article closes by identifying the authors. Former Senator Warren Rudman, Republican of New Hampshire, is a chairman of Americans for Campaign Reform. Former Senator Chuck Hagel, Republican of Nebraska, introduced disclosure legislation in 2001. Let me add, while we await my colleagues who are scheduled to come to the floor, let me add that it is not unique or unusual that Senators Rudman and Hagel, former Republican senators, should be supportive of the Disclose Act and of disclosure of who is making these massive, now secret contributions to buy influence in our elections. First of all, it's not surprising because it's so darned obvious. It should be obvious to any thinking person, as Senators Rudman and Hagel said, that when somebody is spending the kind of money that is being spent, a single donor making, for instance, a $4 million anonymous contribution, they're not doing that out of the goodness of their heart. They're not doing that just for the sheer fun of it. They're doing that because they have a motive. You don't spend $4 million in politics if you don't have a motive. If you think otherwise, you really need to wake up and have a cup of coffee. And if you add to that the insistence on the funding being secret, there's only one reasonable conclusion that a thinking person can draw about why somebody who is spending that kind of money with a motive would want their spending and their identity to be secret. And that's because the motive is a crummy motive. It is a lousy motive for the American people. If the American people were excited about the motive, they wouldn't want to keep it secret. It's only because they want to do bad deeds in the dark. So I will go through, when time permits again, some of the Republican senators who've spoken out in favor of disclosure and transparency in the past. We all know from the debate last night that the minority leader has. I will yield to the chairman as soon as he's prepared here. But Senator Alexander has been on record, Senator Chambliss, Senator Sessions, Senator Cornyn, Senator Murkowski, Senator Collins, Senator Brown of Massachusetts, Senator Coburn, and of course most prominently and most courageously over a long period of time and with great distinction, Senator John McCain. So at this moment, I will yield to my distinguished chairman and friend, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and appreciate his giving his voice to this debate.
Mr. President.
Vermont.
Mr. President, I appreciate what the senator from Rhode Island has done. He has been a champion on this, not only in the public forum like the floor of the Senate, but he's been a champion of it in the cloakrooms, in the committee rooms, everywhere we might speak about it, and he's been most consistent. The people of Rhode Island are very fortunate in having somebody with such a strong voice. For the last 2.5 years, American people have seen the devastating effects of the Citizens United decision. That decision by 5 Supreme Court justices overturned a century of laws that have been supported by Republicans and Democrats alike because they were designed to protect our elections from corporate spending. And what these 5 men did, they unleashed a massive flood of corporate money into our elections. Now, many of us in the Congress, many of us around the country, were at the time of the Citizens United decision that it turns on its head the idea of government of and by the people. We worried that the decision created new rights for Wall Street at the expense of people on Main Street. We worried that powerful corporate megaphones could drown out the voices and interests of individual Americans. I wish I didn't have to say this, but 2.5 years later, it's clear these worries were supremely valid, and the damage is devastatingly real. Since the Citizens United decision struck down long-standing prohibitions on corporations from direct spending in political campaigns, hundreds of millions of dollars from undisclosed and unaccountable sources have flooded the airways with a barrage of negative advertisements. Nobody has watched our elections, even tried to watch television, since the Citizens United decision can deny the enormous impact that decision has had on our political process. Everywhere I go in Vermont, people say, well, who's behind these ads? And many they find offensive in Vermont. They say, well, who's behind these ads? I said, I don't know. They said, well, you're a United States Senator. You mean you don't know? I said, no, because the Supreme Court has allowed people to hide who's paying for them, even though they're doing it to advance their economic interests, often to the exclusion of everybody else's. Even though they're trying to give themselves an advantage that all the rest of the people won't have. And nobody who is trained to hear the voices of the voters lost among the flood of noise from super PACs can deny that by extending First Amendment rights in the political process to corporations, the Supreme Court put at risk the rights of individual Americans to speak to each other and, crucially, to be heard. Yet just last month, without a hearing, without even allowing Americans' voices to be heard, the same 5 justices who in Citizens United ran roughshod over a long-standing precedent to strike down key provisions of our bipartisan campaign finance laws doubled down on Citizens United when they summarily struck down a 100-year-old Montana state law barring corporate contributions to political campaigns, a state law that had been enacted by the people of Montana because they had seen the pervasive and sometimes evil effect of these corporate contributions. In doing so, they broke down the last public safeguards, preventing corporate megaphones from drowning out the voices of hardworking Americans. Because make no doubt about it, we have in our state of Vermont, we have a town meeting day. People come in, they can express any view they want, but you know who's expressing it. You know whether it's John Jones or Mary Smith. You know if it's the head of the local company or somebody speaking for a workers' union. You know who's speaking. And you know that you have just as much right and ability to answer as they did in speaking. Now we're saying, no. Unless you are a wealthy corporation willing to hide who's speaking, you're not going to be heard. The Supreme Court decision not only go against long-standing laws and legal precedents, but also common sense. Contrary to what at least one candidate has said, corporations are not people. Corporations are not the same as individual Americans. Corporations don't have the same rights, the same morals, or the same interests. Corporations cannot vote in our democracy. We could elect General Eisenhower as president, but General Electric and General Motors can't serve as president. But if you go to the logic of these Supreme Court decisions, it virtually says let's elect General Electric or General Motors as president. Nor is the fact these are artificial legal constructs meant to facilitate business. The founders understood this. The founders knew we were not going to allow corporations either to vote or to take over our electoral process. Vermonters and Americans across this great country have long understood this. Apparently, 5 members of the Supreme Court, just 5 people, did not understand this. Like most Vermonters, Republicans and Democrats alike, I strongly believe that something must be done to address the divisive and corrosive decision of the Supreme Court and Citizens United. That decision was wrong. The damage must be repaired. The harmful ways of skewing the democratic process must be fixed. That's why I held the first congressional hearing on that terrible decision in the weeks after it was issued. That's why we scheduled a hearing next week in the Senate Judiciary Committee Constitution Subcommittee, led by the distinguished Senator from Illinois, Senator Durbin, to look at proposals for constitutional amendments to address Citizens United. But today, without waiting for the years and years and years that a constitutional amendment might take, the Senate can take action. By passing the Disclose Act, we can restore transparency and accountability to campaign finance laws by assuring that all Americans know who's paying for campaign ads. It's a crucial step toward restoring the ability of Vermonters and all Americans, voters, to be able to speak, be heard, and to hear competing voices and not be drowned out by powerful corporate interests. Any of us who are in an election, we expect our opponent to be able to speak out. And the public expects, they want to hear from both of us. And they should. That's why we have debates. That's why we have candidates forums. But it all becomes irrelevant if you have a huge megaphone paid for by anonymous donors and anonymous corporations. When I co-sponsored the first Disclose Act after the Supreme Court's decision in 2010, I hoped Republicans would join with Democrats to mitigate the Citizens United decision. From the depths of the Watergate scandal forward until only recently, the principle of disclosure was a bipartisan value. A clear-cut reform like the Disclose Act would have easily drawn bipartisan support in those days after Watergate. I'd hoped that Senate Republicans, like my friend from Arizona, Senator John McCain, who once championed the bipartisan McCain-Feingold campaign finance law, which I supported, would join with us to help to ensure that corporations could not abuse their newfound constitutional rights. Regrettably, every single Republican joined to successfully filibuster the Disclose Act in 2010. And despite a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate, and the American people voting and being in favor of passing the disclosure law, it fell 1 vote short of breaking the Republican filibuster in the Senate. One vote, because not a single Republican would stand up and help us restore some of the core disclosure aspects of McCain-Feingold. Senate Republicans are continuing their filibuster of this common-sense legislation. And by filibustering, they deny the American people an open, public, and meaningful debate on the importance of transparency and accountability in our elections. Last night, they again filibustered the bill, even though a majority in this Senate voted in favor of it. In fact, they refused to even proceed to debate on the bill in the Senate. So instead of being on record as voting yes or no, they say, well, we'll vote maybe. If we filibuster proceeding, we vote maybe. What a profile in courage to stand up and vote maybe. Vote yes to limit the power of corporations, or vote no to allow the power of corporations. Now, I know which vote I would cast, but stand up and vote one way or the other. Have the courage to say either I want the American people's voice to be heard or I want a small number of corporations to be heard. Don't hide behind a maybe vote. That's not what the United States Senate stands for. That is not a profile in courage. And by doing that maybe, which is what they do when they say we can't proceed to this bill, they ensure the ability of wealthy corporations to dominate all mediums of advertising, to drown out the voices of individuals, as we've seen and will continue to see in our elections. Despite the clear impact of ways of unaccountable corporate campaign spending that has led Senator McCain to now concede that super PACs are disgraceful, a minority in the Senate consisting exclusively of Republicans continue to prevent passage of this important law. Why are they against this bill? Why, when so many senators of both parties used to champion disclosure laws, and senators of both parties used to support knowing who is paying for campaign ads, do they continue to prevent us from having a debate? Why, when the Supreme Court made clear, even in the Citizens United decision, the disclosure laws are constitutional, does the Senate Republican leadership insist in stalling this reform? What happened to those Americans who said that our elections should be open? What happened to those Americans who said we ought to know who's involved in these elections? Mr. President, there should be only one thing secret in our elections: your secret vote, your right to vote in secret. One person, one vote. But nothing should say that there should be a powerful, hidden, secret hand overwhelming the voters of America in telling them how they should vote. We know disclosure laws can work because they do work for individual Americans donating directly to political campaigns. Mr. President, when you and I give money directly to a political candidate, our donation is not hidden. It's publicly disclosed, and that candidate, people can look at who's supported him or her, and that goes into their, that's what they'll vote for. Yet those who oppose the Disclosure Act are standing up for special rights for corporations and wealthy donors. Rights, Mr. President, you and I do not have. We've seen since Citizens United that the line the Supreme Court imagined existed between individual campaigns and the super PACs is an all but meaningless one. The super PACs have poured more and more money into influencing election campaigns. In reality, super PACs have simply become a way to funnel secret, massive, non-disclosed donations to political campaigns. The Citizens United decision allowed corporations and large donors to evade the disclosure laws that apply to you and me by giving money to groups that then fund super PACs as a way of laundering the money and keeping secret the real funders of these campaign ads. The average Vermonter wants to contribute to my campaign or my opponent's campaign. That's going to be public. People are going to know, and they'll make up their decisions. Part of their decision will be based on who supports us. But when you have a secret, wealthy entity supporting you, nobody knows who it is. And none of these entities use their real name. They're always for good government, for clean air, for motherhood and apple pie, for the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. There's no reason those funding these super PACs should not be bound by the same disclosure rule for giving directly to campaign. Public disclosure of donation to candidates has never chilled campaign funding. It's never prevented millions of Americans from participating openly. I follow a rule of releasing every single donor to my campaign. I think we had one of 85 cents once, got disclosed. But we have seen some on the other side of this debate disgracefully compare the attempt we're making to ensure that the same disclosure laws apply to you and me also apply to corporations to this shameful effort in the 50s and 60s to keep African Americans from exercising their right to vote. There, the chilling effect often took the form of violence. We all remember the bridge at Selma and the blood that was spilled in the long effort for voting rights that led to the Voting Rights Act. And at a time when we're seeing a renewed effort to deny millions of Americans their right to vote, the voter purges, voter ID laws that serve as modern-day poll taxes. The comparison some made between our effort to bring sunlight and those evil days is as shameful as it's wrong. When the race is on for secret money, election campaigns are won or lost by who can collect the largest amount of secret donations. It puts at risk government of, by, and for the people. Now, our ballots should be secret, but not massive corporate campaign contributions. I can tell you what I'm fighting for. Too many Vermonters and other Americans still looking for work. We need to continue looking for ways to spur job growth and economic investment in this country. We have to continue our efforts to increase jobs and reduce unemployment, support hardworking American families struggling to keep food on the table, roofs over their heads. We have to protect Americans' access to clean air and clean water. We have to fight for their economic security. So we'll keep on fighting for those things. I'm going to put my full statement in the record and ask that it be considered that way. I yield to Senator Whitehouse.
I thank Chairman Leahy. I'd like to ask unanimous consent now in terms of scheduling the floor time that Senator Manchin of West Virginia be recognized now for up to 5 minutes, and I will take his place in the chair, and that Senator McCain, if he is on the floor, be recognized at the conclusion of Senator Manchin's 5-minute period. And if Senator McCain is not present on the floor, that I be recognized in his stead.
And without objection, so ordered.
Senator Manchin.
The senator from West Virginia.
Mr. President, I rise today to address the disturbing role that money is playing in our politics, especially when it comes to anonymous groups with deep pockets that are trying to tear people down. There's no question this is a corrosive situation, and it is hurting our democracy. When you have unaccountable outside groups with virtually unlimited pockets, more and more lawmakers, all of us included, have to spend more time dialing for dollars that take us away from legislating. That's simply backwards, sir. Elected officials should be working on fixing our problems, not having to worry every minute of every day raising money so that you can be protective or fend off people who are attacking you. And the effects are very clear. This Congress is stalled when it comes to tackling our biggest problems as a nation. But we're raising more money in politics than ever before. Those priorities in my state of West Virginia are totally out of order, and we need to do something to change the system. I'm not alone with this concern. In private, I've talked to my fellow senators on both sides, Democrats and Republicans, that basically said they're spending more money, more time raising money for re-election, and that constant fundraising events interfere with the everyday business of governing the great nation and the time that they're spending to do that. Mr. President, I try to spend time in my great state of West Virginia every weekend, and I can tell you that the people of West Virginia are also deeply troubled by the increasing role that money is playing in our politics. Ever since the Supreme Court's decision on the Citizens United campaign finance case, we have seen outside groups unleash an unprecedented flood of money to sway elections. And we've seen it time and again in West Virginia over the past several years. I was deeply troubled by some statistics about how few Americans are involved in financing elections. This is cited by Professor Lawrence Lessig, a campaign finance expert in The Atlantic. And let me put this issue in perspective for all of our viewers and for all of our colleagues. The population of this country is approximately 311 million people. 311 million of us live in this great United States of America. A tiny number of those Americans, 806,000, only 806,000 of the 311 million give more than $200 to a congressional campaign. $200 to a congressional campaign. To break that down even further, only 155,000 out of 311 million contribute the maximum amount to any congressional candidate. Then you look at the people who participate in a number of elections that give more than $10,000 in election cycle, the maximum they can give to a candidate and give to other candidates. So those people in the United States of America, out of 311 million, only 31,000 Americans do that. Only 31,000. Now let me break it down to even the super PAC, the money that comes from the super PACs. Just in this presidential election, Mr. President, just in this presidential election so far, there are only 196 Americans out of 311 million, only 196 people that give hundreds of millions of dollars. They account for 80% of the funding so far, 80%, which is unheard of. First of all, let me thank Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island. He has been truly a champion of common sense, of bringing this together and bringing all sides together. Now, some of my friends would say that spending money to influence an election is their First Amendment right of freedom of speech. To my friends, I understand and respect your concerns, but I truly believe that the Disclose Act won't limit your freedom of speech. Instead, it will prevent the anonymous political campaigning that is undermining our democracy. The people of West Virginia believe that we need openness and transparency to stay informed and keep our democracy strong. And the Disclose Act would do just that. The people of this country have a right to know who is spending large amounts of money to influence elections. And this bill would make the information available. Ask unanimous consent for 2 more minutes, sir.
Without objection.
In fact, the measure is quite simple. Any time that an organization or individual spends $10,000 or more on a campaign-related expense, and that is the thing that's very important, campaign-related expense, they have to file a disclosure report with the Federal Elections Commission within 24 hours. Now, every one of us that run for office have to disclose every penny that we get, and it should be that way. Some states, like our sister state of Virginia, already have a transparency and disclosure law, and it has not stifled their free speech there. Nor does this provision affect organizations' regular operations. The disclosure is only required when organizations and individuals spend money on campaigns or try to influence elections. Instead, this bill makes sure that every person and organization plays fairly by the same rules. Whether those organizations and individuals are in the middle, the left, the right, forward, backward, or upside down, they all have to play by the same rules. In fact, I truly believe that this provision will take an important step towards forward to increase transparency and accountability. That seems only right and fair to me, and I'm proud to cast my vote in favor of the Disclose Act. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President. Mr. President, here we are with 41 months of over 8% unemployment in America, the National Defense Authorization Bill languishing in the shadows while we continue to have this debate, and obviously there's no doubt in most people's minds that with the full knowledge of the sponsors of this legislation that it will not pass, it is obviously for certain political purposes. I oppose cloture on the motion. My reasons for opposing this motion are simple, even though the subject of campaign finance reform is not. In its current form, the Disclose Act is closer to a clever attempt at political gamesmanship than actual reform. By conveniently setting high thresholds for reporting requirements, the Disclose Act forces some entities to inform the public about the origins of their financial support while allowing others, most notably those affiliated with organized labor, to fly below the Federal Election Commission's regulatory radar. As my colleagues, I am sure, are aware, I have a long history fighting for campaign finance reform and to break the influence of money in American politics. And regardless of what the United States Supreme Court may do or say, I continue to be proud of my record because I believe the cause to improve our democracy and further empower the citizens of our country was and continues to be worth fighting for. But let's be clear. Reforms we have successfully enacted over the years have not cured all of the public cynicism about the state of politics in our country. No legislative measure or Supreme Court decision will completely free politics from influence peddling or the appearance of it. But I do believe that fair and just reforms will move many Americans who have grown more and more disaffected from the practices and institutions of our democracy to begin to get a clearer understanding of whether their elected representatives value their commitment to our Constitution more than their own incumbency. For far too long, money and politics have been deeply intertwined. Anyone who has ever run for a federal office will assure you of the fact. Candidates come to Washington not seeking wisdom ideas, but because they need help raising money. The same candidates will most likely tell you that they are asked one question when they announce they're going to seek office. Unfortunately, it's not how do you feel about taxes or what's your opinion of the role of government. No, the question they are asked is, how are you going to raise the money? Couple this sad reality with the dawn of the super PAC spending from corporate treasuries and record spending by big labor, and one can easily see that a major scandal is not far off. And there will be a scandal. Mark my words, there will be one. The American people know it, and I know it. Reform is necessary, but it must be fair and just, and this legislation before us is not. I say that from many years of experience on this issue. A recent Wall Street Journal article by Tom McGinney and Brady Mullins titled, quote, "Political spending by unions far exceeds direct donations," noted that organized labor spent about 4 times as much on politics and lobbying as originally thought. $4.4 billion from 2005 to 2011, according to the Wall Street Journal's analysis. Unions are spending far more money on a wider range of political activities than what is reported to the Federal Election Commission. The report plainly states, and I quote, "This kind of spending, which is on the rise, has enabled the largest unions to maintain and in some cases increase their clout in Washington and state capitals, even though unionized workers make up a declining share of the workforce. The result is that labor can be a stronger counterweight than commonly realized to super PACs that today raise millions from wealthy donors, in many cases to support Republican candidates and causes. The hours spent by union employees working on political matters were equivalent in 2010 to a shadow army, much larger than President Obama's current re-election staff, data analyzed by the Journal show." The report goes on to note, another difference is that companies use their political money differently than unions do, spending a far larger share of it on lobbying while not undertaking anything equivalent to unions' drives to persuade members to vote as their leadership dictates. Corporations and their employees also tend to spread their donations fairly evenly between the two major parties, unlike unions, which overwhelmingly assist Democrats. In 2008, Democrats received 55% of the $2 billion contributed by corporate PACs and company employees, while labor unions were responsible for $75 million in political donations, with 92% of it going to Democrats. The traditional measure of unions' political spending, reports filed with the FEC, undercounts the effort unions pour into politics because the FEC reports are mostly based on donations unions make to individual candidates from their PACs, as well as spending on campaign advertisements. Unions spend millions of dollars yearly paying teams of political hands to contact members, educating them about election issues, and trying to make sure they vote for union-endorsed candidates. Such activities are central to unions' political power. The proportion of members who vote as the leadership prefers has ranged from 68 to 74% over the past decades at AFL-CIO-affiliated unions, according to statistics from the Labor Federation. Additionally, a February 22, 2012 Washington Post article titled "Union Spending for Obama Democrats Could Top $400 Million in 2012 Election." AFSCME reportedly expects to spend $100 million on, quote, political action, including television advertising, phone banks, and member canvassing, while the SEIU plans to spend at least $85 million in 2012. That analysis, combined with the $1.1 billion that the unions reported to the FEC from 2005 through 2011, and the additional $3.3 billion unions reported to the Labor Department over the same period on political activity. The need for equal treatment of political advocacy under the law becomes readily apparent. I repeat again, the need for equal treatment of political advocacy under the law becomes readily apparent. Given the strength and political muscle behind all of these figures, it's easy to understand why disclosure may sound nice, but unless the treatment is completely fair, taking into account the diverse nature and purpose of different types of organizations, disclosure requirements will likely be used to give one side a political advantage over another. That's just one of the flaws of the bill before us today. The Disclose Act would have little impact on unions because of the convenient thresholds for reporting, but would have a huge effect on associations and other advocacy groups. From my own experience, I can state without question that real reform, and in particular campaign finance reform, will never be attained without equal treatment of both sides. A half dose of campaign finance reform will quickly and rightly labeled as political favoritism and will undermine future opportunities for true progress. Furthermore, these sorts of games and measures will only make the American people more cynical and have less faith in what we do. The authors of this bill insist it's fair and not designed to benefit one party over the other. Sadly, the stated intent does not comport with the facts. The Disclose Act is written to burden labor unions significantly less than the other groups. In the United States, there are roughly 14 to 16 million union members, each of whom is required to pay dues to his local union chapter. Historically, these local union chapters send a portion of their revenues up to their affiliated larger, quote, international labor unions. And while each union member's dues may be modest, the amounts that ultimately flow up to the central political arms are vast. The Disclose Act protects this flow of money in two distinct ways. One, organizations that engage in political conduct are only required to disclose payments to it that exceed $10,000 in a two-year election cycle, meaning the local union chapter will not be required to disclose the payments of individual union members to the union, even if those funds will be used for political purposes. What's the final difference between one $10,000 check and 1,000 $10 checks? Other than the impact on trees, very little. So why should one be free from having to disclose its origin? 2, the bill exempts from the disclosure requirement transfers from affiliates that do not exceed $50,000 for a 2-year election cycle. As a result, unions would not have to disclose the transfers made to it by many of its smaller local chapters. Given the contrast between union and corporate structures, this would allow unions to fall beneath the bill's threshold limits. For local union chapters, this anonymity is probably very important because, among other effects, it prevents union chapters members from learning how much of their dues payments are being used on political activities. And while the exemptions outlined in the Disclose Act may be facially applied to business organizations and associations, it is apparent to me that the union's unique pyramid-style ground-up money funneling structure would allow unions to not be treated equally by the Disclose Act. Unlike unions, most organizations do not have thousands of local affiliates where they can pull up to $50,000 in, quote, affiliate transfers. I've been involved in the issue of campaign finance reform for most of my career. I am proud of my record. I am supportive of measures which call for full and complete disclosures of all spending in federal campaigns. I reaffirm this commitment by submitting an amicus brief to the United States Supreme Court regarding campaign finance reform, along with the author of the Disclose Act. This bill falls short. The American people will see it for what it is: political opportunism at its best, political demagoguery at its worst. My former colleague from Wisconsin, Senator Feingold, and I set out to eliminate the corrupting influence of soft money and to reform how our campaigns are paid for. We vowed to be truly bipartisan and do nothing which would give one party a political advantage over the other. And the fact is that this gives one party an advantage over the other. And I say with great respect to the senator from Rhode Island, the way I began campaign finance reform, I'll tell the senator from Rhode Island, is I found a person on the other side of the aisle who was willing to work with me, and we worked together to campaign finance reform. The senator from Rhode Island and the sponsors of this bill have no one on this side of the aisle. So by not having anyone on this aisle, the senator from Rhode Island is now embarked in a partisan enterprise. I suggest strongly to the sponsors of the bill, if they are serious about campaign finance reform, about curing the evils that are going on now, they will approach members on this side of the aisle and make sure that our concerns about the role of labor unions in financing of political campaigns are addressed as well. It's too bad that the members on that side of the aisle are now orchestrating a vote which is strictly partisan in nature when they know full well that the only way that truly campaign finance reform will ever be enacted by the Congress of the United States is in a bipartisan fashion. This is a partisan bill, and I am disappointed that we are wasting the time of the United States Senate on a bill that on a cause that is of utmost importance, in my view, in a partisan fashion. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, before I yield the floor to Senator Sanders, I wanted to take 1 minute and thank Senator McCain for his many, many years of principled advocacy in this area. People have written entire books about the work that he has done. I think it was Elizabeth Drew who wrote one of the best books about the courage that Senator McCain has shown over the years. So I come to this debate with enormous respect for him. I will say that this bill is not bipartisan, but that is not for lack of trying. We have reached out over and over again, and in the face of an absolute stonewall on this subject, have changed the bill ourselves in order to accommodate concerns. The stand by your ad provision was criticized by the Republican witness in the Rules Committee. so we removed it. The NRA, the National Rifle Association, was livid about the $600 threshold because it would require them to disclose their members. So we raised it to $10,000. Over and over again, where there have been substantive objections to the bill, we have met them. And at this point, not one Republican for all of our contacts across the aisle has expressed any place in this bill where an amendment could be made. We've never been given any language. We've never been shown the area that, in theory, is better for the unions. It is, as Senator McCain himself admitted, facially applied to corporations and unions and other organizations alike. And I would refer back to the op-ed in today's New York Times by Republican former Senators Rudman and Hagel, agreeing that this is, in fact, a fair bill. It is balanced among all parties, and all senators should support it. And with that, I will yield the floor to my Senator Sanders with appreciation for him allowing me that moment of his time.
Mr. President. Senator from Vermont. Mr. President, I want to thank Senator Whitehouse, Senator Schumer, and all of those who have been working so hard on this enormously important issue, which has everything to do with whether or not our country remains the kind of democracy that most of us want it to be. Mr. President, I come to the Senate floor today to express my profound disgust with the current state of our campaign finance system and to call for my fellow senators as a short-term effort to pass the Disclose Act. Passing the Disclose Act would be an important step forward, but clearly we have much more to do on this issue. Long-term, of course, we need a constitutional amendment to overturn this disastrous Supreme Court decision, the Citizens United 5-4 decision of 2 years ago. Long-term, in my view, we also need to move this country toward public funding of elections so that once and for all, big money will not dominate our political process. Long-term, there is no question in my mind that Citizens United will go down in history as one of the worst decisions ever rendered by a United States Supreme Court. 5 members of the court came to the bizarre conclusion that corporations should be treated as if they were people, that they have a First Amendment right to spend as much money as they want, to buy candidates, to buy elections, and somehow, in the midst of all of this unbelievable amount of spending, millions and millions of dollars, the Supreme Court came to the conclusion that this would not even give the appearance of corruption. I think that is, frankly, an absurd conclusion. Mr. President, let me tell you, and my take on this may be a little bit different than some of my colleagues, what concerns me most about the Citizens United decisions. And that is, if we look at Citizens United in tandem with other trends in our economy today, what we see is that this nation is rapidly moving from an economic and political sense to an oligarchic form of society. Economically, what we see are fewer and fewer people who control our economy. We see a nation which has the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country on earth, in which the top 1% of our nation owns 40% of the wealth, the bottom 60% own 2% of the wealth. And that gap between the very, very wealthy and everybody else is growing wider and wider. That's wealth. And in terms of income distribution, the situation is even worse. The last study that we have seen suggests that 93% of all new income between 2009 and 2010 went to the top 1%. So economically, we are moving toward a nation in which a few people have a significant amount of the wealth of America, significant amount of the income of America in terms of concentration of ownership. We see a situation in which 6 financial institutions on Wall Street have assets equivalent to 2/3 of the GDP of the United States of America, over $9 trillion, controlled by 6 financial institutions whose recklessness, whose greed, whose illegal behavior drove us into the recession that we're struggling with right now. So as a nation now, the trends are fewer and fewer people own the wealth of America, fewer and fewer large corporations control the economy of America. But apparently, that is not good enough for the 1%, for our millionaire and billionaire friends. Now what they want to do is take that wealth and exercise it even more than has been the case in the past in the political realm, which now takes us to Citizens United. Now, in the real world, we all know what's going on with Citizens United. We know that billionaires are saying, look, yeah, it's great that I own an oil company, great that I own a coal company, great that I own gambling casinos, but gee, I could have even more fun by owning the United States government. So you have entities out there who are worth some $50 billion. The Koch brothers come to mind. And if you're worth $50 billion and you have all kinds of interactions with the federal government, you have strong political views, why wouldn't they spend $400 million, which is what the media says that family is going to spend, and maybe even more if you could purchase the United States government? That's not a bad investment. That's what Citizens United is about. It is billionaires spending huge amounts of money without disclosure. Without disclosure. Now, I would have gone further than this bill, but this bill is certainly an important step forward. What does it require? It says if you're going to spend more than $10,000 on a campaign, in a campaign, that you have to make public who you are. I don't think that is a terribly onerous provision. Now, the American people are not stupid. They understand that if somebody is going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on political activities, they want something. That's what it is about. Why do people make campaign contributions? Now, many of us get a whole lot of campaign contributions from folks who give us $25, $30, $40. Most of my campaign contributions come from people who give us less than $200. But if somebody is going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a campaign, I think the American people have a right to know who that is and what they want, who is taking that money, and what those contributors are going to get in return. If you're a billionaire and you want lower taxes, have the courage to say, hey, I'm a billionaire, I'm putting money into a party, and what I'm going to get out of it is lower taxes for the rich. And if I'm somebody in a corporation that is polluting the air and the land and the water, and I want to get rid of those regulations, have the guts to come forward and say, yeah, that's what I want. I want to eviscerate the EPA. I don't care that children in Vermont or Rhode Island get sick. That's what I want. So what this is about is fairly elementary. What this is about is simply having those people, those institutions, corporations that are putting in unions, putting more than $10,000 into the political process, say who they are. Now, what concerns me very much about this whole process, and I think concerns the American people, is while our middle class disappears and poverty increases, while the gap between the very wealthy and everybody else is growing wider, it appears very clear right now that these folks are not simply content. The top 1% are not simply content with owning the economy, with controlling the economy. They now want to control to an even greater degree than is currently the case, the political process as well. And that's what these campaign contributions of hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars are about. When I think back on the history of this country and the enormous sacrifices that men and women made defending the American ideal, the ideal that was a vision to the entire world looked to the United States for what a strong democracy was about. One person, one vote. In my state of Vermont, we have March meetings. People come out. One person, one vote to discuss the municipal town budget, to discuss the school budget. And now we have evolved to a situation where one family can spend $400 million buying politicians, buying elections. That is a long, long way away from what democracy is supposed to mean in this country. So, Mr. President, the Disclose Act is a very important first step forward, and I hope that we can get strong support for that important piece of legislation. And with that, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, Senator Murray will be here shortly, and until